The sun was a merciless hammer in a brass sky, beating down on the cracked earth until it shattered into a mosaic of despair. In the heart of this furnace lay a woman, her fine traveling dress torn to rags, her lips cracked and bleeding, a testament to a promise that had turned to dust. She was a ghost haunting the daylight, her hope a single, fading ember in the vast, indifferent wilderness. This was the end of her journey, the final, cruel stop for a mail-order bride who had been purchased, paid for, and discarded like so much freight. Have you ever felt so utterly abandoned that the world itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for you to surrender? This is the story of Clara, a woman left for dead in the dust. But it is also the story of what happens when a soul on the brink of despair is found by another who had long ago forgotten what it meant to hope. It is a story that asks a simple question. Can a life be rebuilt from the ashes of betrayal? And can love truly find you when you are lost in the middle of nowhere? This is the story of a love that was never supposed to be, born in the silence between two wounded hearts, a love as fierce and enduring as the frontier itself. His name was Kalen, and his life was a testament to silence. He moved through the canyons and mesas like a shadow, his past a heavy cloak he wore even in the searing heat of the day. He was a scout, a man who read the land the way other men read books, but he had long since stopped trying to read the hearts of men. They were a language of betrayal he no longer wished to understand. He was tracking the faint prints of shod horses, men who rode heavy and careless, but it was another sign that had stopped him, a single, impossible track half obliterated by the wind, the footprint of a lady's shoe. It made no sense here in this unforgiving territory. It was a fragment of a different world, a world of parlors and promises he had fled. He followed it, a grim curiosity pulling him forward, expecting to find what the desert always delivered to the unprepared. Bones picked clean by vultures. Instead, he found her. She was huddled against a rock, a splash of pale blue fabric against the ochre dust. Her breathing so shallow it was little more than a whisper of life. He saw the remnants of a fine bonnet, the terror still etched on her face even in unconsciousness. A part of him, the wounded part that had built a fortress around his heart, urged him to ride on. She was not his concern. She was a complication, a ghost from the very civilization that had brought him nothing but pain. But another part of him, the part that remembered honor, the part that was his father's son, could not obey. He dismounted, his movements economical and sure. He knelt beside her, the leather of his leggings creaking in the profound silence. He lifted his canteen to her lips, the water a sacrament in this godless expanse. As the first drops touched her mouth and she stirred with a low moan, Kalen knew his solitude was over. He had found more than a lost woman in the dust. He had found a reason, and he was terrified of it. The journey back to his cabin was a silent ordeal. He had lifted Clara onto his horse, her slight weight a strange burden against his chest, and walked the long miles, his hands steady on the reins. She drifted in and out of a fevered consciousness, murmuring words he could not understand, her vulnerability a constant, sharp pressure against the armor he had so carefully constructed. His cabin was not a home. It was a refuge, a place of self-imposed exile tucked into a crease of the mountains, built of sturdy pine and stubborn solitude. He carried her inside, away from the judging eye of the sun, and laid her on his own cot, the only soft place in the entire dwelling. For days she was a specter in his life. He fed her broth, cleaned her wounds, and listened to the ragged sound of her breathing fill the silence he had once cherished. She was terrified of him. He could see it in the way her eyes widened whenever he entered the room, the way she flinched from his touch. He did not blame her. He was a stranger with a hard face and hands calloused by a rough life, a native man in a world that had taught women like her to fear him. He did not offer soft words of comfort. They were a currency he no longer possessed. Instead, he offered consistency. Every morning, there was fresh water by the cot. Every evening, a bowl of stew, rich with meat and wild vegetables. He would set it on the small crate beside her and retreat to the other side of the cabin, cleaning his rifle or mending a saddle, his silence a shield for them both. He watched as the fear in her eyes slowly began to recede, replaced by a profound and weary confusion. She was a woman of good breeding, he could tell. Her hands, though blistered and raw now, were shaped for finer things than survival. What cruel twist of fate had brought her to his door? The question was a dangerous one, for it implied a story, and stories were the first threads of connection, the first cracks in the wall of his isolation. A week bled into 2. The rhythm of their shared existence settled into a quiet routine, as predictable as sunrise. The turning point came not with a grand gesture, but with a simple needle and thread. Clara, her strength slowly returning, had noticed the tear in the sleeve of his only good shirt. One afternoon, while he was outside chopping wood, the rhythmic thud a steady heartbeat for their small world, she found his mending kit. Her fingers, still clumsy from her ordeal, worked the needle with a determined focus. When he came back inside, weary and smelling of pine, he stopped dead in the doorway. She was sitting up on the cot, the shirt in her lap, the last rays of sun from the single window illuminating the fine, even stitches she was making. It was an act of domesticity, an act of care so profound in its simplicity that it struck him like a physical blow. He said nothing, but he took the shirt from her outstretched hand, his rough fingers brushing hers, and the current that passed between them was more potent than any spoken word. From that day, the silence began to thaw. She started to help, sweeping the floor with a handmade broom, tending the small fire in the hearth. He, in turn, began to speak. He taught her the names of the mountain herbs, the difference between the call of a hawk and an eagle. He showed her how to read the clouds for signs of rain. One evening, by the flickering firelight, she finally told him her story. Her name was Clara. She was from a respectable but impoverished family in the East. An arrangement had been made. A wealthy man in Santa Fe, a Mr. Alastair Finch, had paid her passage to be his wife. The men he sent to escort her from the station were brutes. They had taken her money, her dignity, and left her to die. As she spoke, the tears she had held back for so long finally fell, silent tears for the life she had lost and the shame she felt. Kalen listened, his face an unreadable mask of stone, but his eyes were a storm of old griefs. When she finished, he simply said, "Finch, I know the name." And in those 4 words, she knew she was not alone in her judgment of the man. "You are safe here, Clara," he added, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely allowed himself. It was not a promise of romance, but of protection. And for Clara, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. In a sprawling adobe hacienda in Santa Fe, a world away from the quiet cabin in the mountains, Alastair Finch swirled brandy in a crystal glass. He was a man accustomed to acquisition, be it land, cattle, or people. He viewed the world as his personal ledger, and every entry had to be in his favor. Clara had been one such entry, an educated, beautiful woman from a good family, meant to be the jewel of his establishment, a testament to his power and influence. He had not mourned her supposed death in the desert. He had been infuriated by the loss of his investment and the inconvenience of it all. He was dictating a letter to a cowering secretary when a man named Jedediah, a bounty hunter with a face like a worn boot, was shown in. Jedediah was a man who trafficked in whispers and rumors, and he had brought Finch a tantalizing one. "The girl, Finch," Jedediah said, his voice a low growl. "The one my boys were escortin'. Seems they might have bungled the job." Finch's eyes narrowed to dangerous slits. "Explain yourself." Jedediah leaned forward, the smell of cheap whiskey and sweat filling the opulent office. "Word from a trader down near the Mogollon Rim. Saw a Navajo scout, a real loner they call Kalen, ridin' with a woman. A white woman, pale, looked half dead. Matched the description of your bride." A possessive, venomous rage began to smolder in Alastair Finch's chest. It was not about Clara, the person. It was about the principle. Something of his had been taken. His property had not only survived, it had fallen into the hands of a native, a man he considered less than human. The insult was intolerable. The shame was a stain on his reputation. "A Navajo scout," Finch repeated, the words tasting like ash. This Kalen. Where does he live? Jedediah grinned, revealing a row of yellowed teeth. He keeps to himself. Got a cabin somewhere deep in the mountains. Hard to find. But for the right price, anything can be found. Finch stood up and walked to his window, looking out over the town he essentially owned. Find him, he commanded, his voice cold and sharp as splintered ice. Gather a dozen men you trust to be ruthless. I want my property back. And I want the savage who took her to make an example of. The hunt was on. The season began to turn. The brutal heat of summer softened into the golden melancholy of autumn. In the small cabin, a fragile peace had taken root and begun to blossom. Clara no longer looked like a ghost. Color had returned to her cheeks, and her laughter, a sound Kalen had never expected to hear, would sometimes echo in the small space as he taught her a word in his native tongue or she recounted a story from her childhood. She had discovered a strength in herself she never knew she possessed, a resilience born not in a Boston parlor, but in the heart of the wilderness. She could now start a fire with a single flint strike, identify edible plants, and stitch a wound with a steady hand. Kalen, too, was changing. The hard lines around his eyes had softened. He found himself sharing stories of his own boyhood, of learning to track with his grandfather, of the legends his people told about the stars. He was still a man of few words, but his silences were now comfortable, filled with a shared understanding that ran deeper than language. He had built this cabin as a place to hide from the world, but with Clara in it, it had become a home. One crisp afternoon, as they sat outside mending a fishing net, a sense of profound contentment settled over him. He looked at her, her brow furrowed in concentration, the autumn sun catching the gold in her hair, and he felt a powerful, protective love that was both terrifying and exhilarating. His redemption was no longer an abstract concept. It had a name, and her name was Clara. It was in that perfect, tranquil moment that the sound came. The distant but unmistakable sound of multiple horses, moving with purpose through the valley. Kalen was on his feet in an instant, his face reverting to the stone mask of the warrior. All the peace of the past months evaporated like mist. Inside, he commanded, his voice low and urgent, "Get in the root cellar and do not make a sound. No matter what you hear." Fear, cold and familiar, gripped Clara's heart, but she saw the resolve in his eyes and obeyed without question. As she lowered herself into the dark, earthy space beneath the floorboards, she heard the riders burst into the clearing. The lead rider's voice was slick with arrogance and malice. "Kalen, I know you're in there. I've come for what is mine." It was the voice of Alistair Finch. The confrontation was a clash of two worlds. Alistair Finch, dressed in fine, tailored leather, sat astride a magnificent black stallion, flanked by a dozen hired guns whose faces were a roadmap of cruelty. He was the picture of entitled power. Kalen stood alone in the doorway of his humble cabin, armed with a rifle and a lifetime of understanding this land. He was a king in his own small kingdom, and Finch was an invader. "She is not yours," Kalen said, his voice calm and steady, carrying across the clearing with absolute authority. Finch laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "I have a contract. I paid her passage. She is my property to do with as I please. Now send her out, and I might let you live, savage." The slur was designed to provoke, to ignite a reckless rage. But Kalen's anger was a cold, deep river, not a flash flood. He knew that to fight these men on their terms was to lose. His strength was not in numbers, but in knowledge. "This is my land," Kalen stated simply. "Leave now." Finch's face purpled with fury. "Kill him," he snarled to his men. The world exploded into chaos. Gunfire shattered the mountain silence. But Kalen was already gone, melting back into the shadows of the cabin. He moved with a predator's grace, firing not from the door, but from the window, then from a small chink in the log wall, never in the same place twice. The attackers, expecting a simple fight, grew confused, firing at ghosts. From her hiding place in the root cellar, Clara could hear everything. The thunder of guns, the splintering of wood, the panicked shouts of Finch's men. She was paralyzed by terror, her hands pressed over her ears. She was the damsel in distress, the helpless prize. But then she heard a man's voice, right above her, near the back of the cabin. "He's circling around to the woodpile. I've got him." She heard the telltale click of a rifle being cocked. Kalen was being flanked. He would be shot in the back. In that moment, something inside Clara snapped. The fear did not vanish, but it was eclipsed by a fierce, primal need to protect the man who had saved her. The girl from Boston died in that cellar, and a frontier woman was born. Her eyes fell upon an old lantern and a tin of oil. With trembling hands, she acted. The plan was born of desperation and courage. Clara scrambled out of the cellar at the back of the cabin, staying low, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The gunman was crouched behind a stack of firewood, his rifle aimed at the corner of the house where Kalen would soon appear. He was so focused on his target he never saw her coming. With a cry that was half prayer, half war, Clara threw the lit lantern into the dry tinder of the woodshed next to the man. It shattered, and the oil-soaked wood erupted in a whoosh of flame. The gunman screamed in surprise and pain as the fire leaped at him, his ambush forgotten. The sudden inferno created the perfect diversion. The other men shouted in alarm, their attention drawn to the roaring fire that now threatened to engulf the clearing. Kalen seized the opportunity. He burst from the cabin, no longer a phantom, but a whirlwind of righteous fury. He moved through the disorganized gunmen not just as a marksman, but as a warrior using his rifle as a club, his knowledge of hand-to-hand combat a brutal and efficient storm. He was fighting for more than his life now. He was fighting for their home. He was fighting for Clara. He saw her then, standing near the burning woodshed, her face smudged with soot, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fierce determination. She had not been a damsel in distress. She had been his partner. She had saved him. That knowledge gave him the strength of 10 men. The fight was short and decisive. The hired guns, their leader a coward and their morale broken, were quickly subdued or fled into the woods. Soon, only one man was left standing against Kalen. Alistair Finch. The wealthy man fumbled for his pistol, his face a mask of disbelief and rage that his money and power had failed him. Kalen was on him in a heartbeat, disarming him with a swift, brutal efficiency that sent the pistol flying into the dirt. The great Alistair Finch was left weaponless, pathetic, and defeated. The threat was not yet over, not completely. It ended when Clara walked out of the smoke, her chin held high, and stood before the man who had tried to own her. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and burning pine. Alistair Finch, disarmed and humiliated, stared at Clara as if she were an apparition. He saw not the timid girl he had bought, but a woman forged in the very wilderness he had tried to use as a weapon. Her dress was smudged and torn, but she wore it like armor. "You," he breathed, a mixture of awe and hatred in his voice. "I am not your property, Mr. Finch," Clara said, her voice clear and steady, ringing with a power she had never known she possessed. "I am not a contract or an investment. I am a woman, and my life is my own." Each word was a nail in the coffin of his arrogance. Kalen stood silently beside her, his rifle held loosely at his side. He did not need to speak. This was her victory, her declaration of independence. She had faced her tyrant not with a weapon, but with the unassailable truth of her own spirit. Finch looked from her defiant face to Kalen's stoic presence, and something in him finally broke. The fight was over. He had been defeated not merely by force, but by a strength he could not comprehend. The strength of two people standing together, a bond forged in the crucible of shared hardship. "Get on your horse," Kalen said, his voice a low rumble of thunder. "Ride out of these mountains and do not return. If I ever see your face on this land again, the desert will have your bones." There was no doubt in his tone. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact. Alistair Finch, the possessive tyrant, scrambled for his horse with the haste of a beaten dog and fled, his remaining men melting away into the forest after him. Silence descended upon the clearing, broken only by the crackle of the dying fire. The threat was vanquished. Clara and Kaelin stood together in the ruins, the smoke curling around them like a shroud. He turned to her, his dark eyes searching her face, seeing not the woman he had rescued, but the woman who had fought beside him. He reached out and gently brushed a smudge of soot from her cheek. In that single, tender gesture, a new chapter began, written not in fear and survival, but in the quiet, unshakable language of love. 1 year later, the scar on the land had healed. Where the burnt woodshed had once stood, a vibrant garden now bloomed, its rows of corn, squash, and beans a testament to new life. The cabin itself had grown, a new room added with practiced, loving hands, its windows open to the mountain air. The tang of wood smoke and baking bread hung in the air, the scent of a true home. Clara moved about the porch, hanging clean laundry on a line, her movements filled with a graceful contentment. The harsh frontier had not broken her. It had revealed her. She had found her place not in a fine house in Santa Fe, but here, in the heart of the wild, with a man who spoke more with his hands and his heart than he ever did with his mouth. Kaelin sat on the steps, the afternoon sun warming his back. The haunted look that had once lived in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet peace. He was carving a small wooden bird, his skilled hands moving with practiced ease. At his feet sat a small, dark-haired boy, their son, watching his father with wide, curious eyes. The boy was a perfect fusion of their two worlds, a symbol of a love that had bridged the divide of culture, language, and pain. Kaelin handed the finished bird to the boy, whose face broke into a delighted smile. Clara paused in her work, her heart swelling with a love so profound it felt as vast as the sky above them. This was their happily ever after. It wasn't a grand or dramatic thing. It was a mosaic of quiet moments. A shared meal, a sleeping child, a knowing glance across a room. Kaelin had found his redemption not in forgetting his past, but in building a future. Clara had found her freedom not in escaping the wilderness, but in embracing it. Together, they had built a family, a sanctuary forged in fire, dust, and an unyielding love. And so, a life that began in the ashes of betrayal found its purpose in a love that was as wild, as resilient, and as beautiful as the land that cradled it. The story of Clara and Kaelin is not just a tale of the past. It is a timeless reminder that our deepest wounds can often lead us to our greatest strengths, and that the person we are meant to be is sometimes waiting to be discovered in the most unexpected of places. Have you ever wondered if your greatest trial could lead to your greatest triumph? The human heart, much like a desert flower, possesses an astonishing capacity to bloom in the most seemingly impossible conditions, drawing strength from the very hardness of the ground that holds it. It teaches us that home is not a place you find, but a place you build with someone who sees you, protects you, and stands with you when the world tries to tear you down. What trials in your own life have revealed a strength you never knew you had? Let us know your story in the comments below. If you believe in the power of love and redemption to heal the deepest of wounds, please share the story with others and subscribe for more tales of the untamed heart.